Welcome everyone to BHP's Retail Shareholder Question and Answer session. I'm James Agar and I'm joined today by BHP's Chief Executive Officer, Mike Henry. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, James.
Mike, your first day in the job was 1st of January this year. I bet you wouldn't have predicted the 4 months we've just experienced back in January.
No, not quite the first 4 months I was anticipating, James. But look, in all seriousness, it's been a different 4 months. It's been challenging at times, but the single biggest thing I would call out around the past 4 months is that it has validated everything I've believed about BHP in terms of who we are, what we stand for, and what's possible within BHP. To see the way that 72,000 people have come together across the company to support each other, to support the communities that we operate in and the others that rely on BHP has been pretty magnificent, and it's something I really couldn't be prouder of. And I think through their efforts, we've managed to keep everybody safe and healthy and keep operating. And that's something that I think is a real testament to BHP's purpose, the values that we hold, and in many respects, it's given us a glimpse into the BHP that we aspire to be.
We mentioned the fact that we've been able to keep operating. Mike, last week, BHP announced its quarterly operational performance for the March 2020 quarter. It seemed to point to pretty strong operational performance across the board.
It did, James, and keep in mind that performance was unlocked in the face of COVID-19 challenges and some pretty serious weather disruptions in particular in some of our Australian assets. So I think, again, that's a testament to the 72,000 people from across the company and the way that they've come together to deal with the challenges that have been thrown at us. And I think that performance has been recognized externally as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike. Well, thank you to all those shareholders that have submitted questions. We've had lots of great questions come through. We'll do our best to get through them all. We'll start with a topic that I think is dear to the hearts of all of our retail shareholders, and that's dividends. I'll ask a specific question here. Mike, we've seen news of other companies deciding to reduce or suspend their dividend programs. This shareholder asks, will BHP be able to maintain its dividend during this crisis?
I'm glad that question came up first, James, because I know it's a question that's on the minds of many of our shareholders who depend on BHP for dividends. And probably the best way of answering that question is to talk about how we think about capital allocation. And we start with a recognition that we are in a cyclical industry. Resources is by its very nature cyclical. And so it's important that we protect the balance sheet. So that's a significant priority in our capital allocation framework. But recognizing that cyclicality, we also have a flexible dividend. And that both allows us to ensure that we maintain a strong balance sheet, but also allows us to pay a flexible dividend through the cycle. And basically the policy says that we will pay out 50% of our earnings, or minimum 50% of our earnings, in any given period. So that's a policy that's stood us in good stead. It's allowed us to maintain a strong balance sheet and to continue to pay a dividend through the cycle. Now, the third and final thing I would point to is our underlying operating performance, which of course is also important. And in spite of the challenging markets that we find ourselves in, as you called out around the third quarter operational performance, the business is performing pretty well. And that will support overall financial performance and earnings.
Right, Mike, well, you mentioned the capital allocation framework that BHP has. A core part of that is the investment decisions we make. We've got a question here on capital expenditure, and they ask specifically how much capital expenditure do we expect to cut?
I'll start by saying that we are in great shape. I referenced the strong balance sheet that we have earlier. We also see one of BHP's real strengths as being the ability to invest through the cycle and to create long-term value. So there will be many projects that we continue on with, but we'll also be prudent. And in the face of the challenges posed by COVID-19, we will look at where it makes sense maybe to defer some projects to preserve cash, or where it may make sense for us to defer projects because that's the value maximizing decision. And I'll come to a couple of examples of that in a second. The final category of projects that we may look to slow up would be those projects where deferral can help us address some of the COVID-19 health and safety risks. So if I touch on that first category of deferral for cash or for value, I would bring forward a few examples in our petroleum business, where together with our joint venture partner, we've elected to defer the Scarborough final investment decision. We also have a number of smaller projects in petroleum where they have shorter life cycles. And so it may make sense from a value perspective for us to push these projects back by a bit in a rising market. So that will allow us to capture more value. So there'll be some of those sorts of projects. Another example would, an example of a project where we're deferring in order to deal with COVID-19 would be our spent growth option project down in Chile, where in order to reduce the overall number of people on site, we've slowed up some of the activity. That allows us to increase social distancing and thereby reduce the rate of, or mitigate the risk of spread of COVID-19. So we will have some examples in both those categories. I'm confident that our capital expenditure for financial year 21 will be lower than the $8 billion that we've spoken to the market about previously. But as to the specifics on that and further clarity, we'll come back with that at our full year results in a few months' time.
Okay, Mike, well, let's stay on the subject of investment. We've had a couple of shareholders who are looking beyond the BHP portfolio for opportunities and are interested in M&A specifically. We've got a question here. We're in trying times, Mike, and a lot of companies are doing it tough. Is there an opportunity to pick something up at a bargain price?
Right. So the first priority, James, by a country mile, is running the base business well. We have to stay safe, and we have to continue to run our base assets for full value. But of course, we'll be present to the opportunities. Now, I think it's important that we all keep in mind the sorts of opportunities that are attractive to BHP. We have a tried and tested strategy that has served us very well and has allowed us to create great value over time. And that strategy sees us focused on only really attractive commodities. So commodities where we can see strong supply and demand fundamentals, good industry, and a big enough size to make it relevant to BHP. Within those attractive commodities, we then want great assets. These are big assets that sit low on the cost curve and which are expandable over time. The sorts of assets that meet those tests are few and far between, and they tend to be the assets that other companies want to hang on to. So our experience has been that those assets don't come free that often. But if they do come free, then we definitely want to be present to those opportunities, and we've got the balance sheet that would allow us to pursue them. But we have to be disciplined. This isn't any old asset at any old price. It's only assets that meet that strict kind of strategic test that I mentioned, and it has to be at the right price. And the final point I would note is that any of these opportunities also get tested through our capital allocation framework against the alternative opportunities that we have for cash and to grow value and returns.
Okay, Mike. Well, look, key to any investment decision is obviously the fundamentals of the markets that we sell into and the commodities that we produce. We've had a number of questions on our outlook for the various commodities that are in our portfolio and the markets that we sell into. I'll ask one question here. What impact do you expect remote working and travel restrictions will have on the steel market and the oil market? And as an addition, we've had another question, get straight to the point. What is the future of oil?
Okay, thanks, James. So that's both a short-term question and a long-term question. Short-term, what's the impact of COVID-19 been on steel and oil? And then longer-term, what's the, how do we see the oil business? Short-term impact on steel and oil has clearly been there, and that comes from reduced transport or mileage in the case of oil, where we've seen a reduction in people commuting to work, in recreational transport, in commercial transport. All of that's had an impact, and it's reduced oil demand. In the case of steel, we have seen a reduction in steel demand as many companies around the world have gone into lockdown, and we've seen a reduction in underlying economic activity. But for both steel and oil, we're confident that as the world comes out of COVID-19, that demand will recover again. The fundamentals of global population growth, of the billions of people around the world who are seeking to lift their living standards, of further industrialization, of further motor vehicles being purchased around the world, all of these things are going to lead to ongoing demand for oil and steel, or recovery in demand for oil and steel. Longer term for oil, again, we continue to believe in the fundamentals. I think it's important to note for oil, though, because we do look at various scenarios. We don't just look at a single case outcome. We look at outcomes where demand may be less than what we're currently anticipating. But in the case of oil, natural field decline. So this is the rate at which current production declines because oil reservoirs get depleted. A conservative estimate of that is about 3% per annum. And so even in a world where demand flattens or it declines a little bit, so it's less than what we expect, the world's still going to need more investment in new production capacity just to meet that natural field decline. And that will gives rise to attractive long-term fundamentals for oil.
All right, well, let's stick with oil and the outlook comments you've just made and how that links back to BHP's business. We've got a question, this is back into the short term. With the recent drop in oil prices, has the short-term strategy changed for BHP's petroleum business?
So I'll start, James, with BHP being a long-term company and a long-term value creator. However, of course, in the face of near-term pressures, the teams have been taking action to protect the business. And I spoke earlier about some of what we're considering on the capital expenditure front and maybe pushing a little bit of that out. I would also note that the operational teams in petroleum and the commercial teams have been coming together in a very dynamic way to ensure that we can keep the barrels moving and we can maximize netback prices. So we're managing both for the near term and for the long term. Our petroleum business is a good business. We've got great assets and a great team. There's lots of optionality in that business and opportunity to grow value over time, and we continue to see that potential in the petroleum business.
All right, well, let's step out beyond just petroleum, Mike. We've had a question on BHP's broader sales book and the diversification of its products. I'll just read the question out. Is there a lesson from the outcome of the pandemic that big companies like BHP need to be more resilient through increasing the diversification of its customer base? And they go on to ask, should we be so dependent on markets like China?
So look, it's a very relevant and interesting question, James, and I know that shareholders will want to ensure that their BHP is a resilient company and that it's fighting fit and able to deal with all points in the cycle. But look, probably two things to mention here. One is, if I specifically talk about China, China's been a great business partner to BHP, or Chinese companies have been great business partners to BHP for over 100 years now. We have many customers in China, many suppliers in China, and our trade relationship with these companies continues to be strong. We continue to have constructive dialogue. Through the crisis, they've been very supportive and focused on ensuring that they can meet their offtake and supply commitments to BHP. And I expect that's going to continue. But on the broader point around diversification, we are a diversified company and we're a very resilient company. We've demonstrated that for well over 100 years now. This isn't the first crisis that we've seen in the past 20 years, and we've always come through these things strongly. And it's in part because of our diversification, both on, in terms of the commodities that we're in, the markets that we sell into, as well as where we secure our supplies from. So this has been a deliberate area of focus for us. And you see that diversification benefit shining through currently, where on the one hand, we've got oil, where we have multi-decade lows in pricing and markets are pretty challenged. To the other end, in iron ore, where iron ore prices have held up and the markets have remained strong, in part because of the economic recovery that's underway in China. We are a resilient company, and part of that resilience comes through the diversification of the portfolio. Part of it comes through all of the focus that we've had on ensuring that we have a strong balance sheet and that we've got great assets that sit at the bottom of the respective cost curves.
Okay, Mike, well, let's bring the focus back now to BHP's operations. We've got a question here from a shareholder. Why is BHP continuing to operate through this crisis? What actions have we taken to protect the health and well-being of our workforce?
So that's a very fair question, James, and I know that that's one that has been on some people's minds. I'll start by saying that we will only operate if we believe that we can keep our people healthy and safe. That's always been BHP's first priority, and it's a priority. It's our first priority today. I would also note, though, that this is an industry and that we're a company who has a long track record of a very disciplined approach to how we think through risks and how we go about controlling those risks effectively. And COVID-19 is no different. We've put in place specific controls around social distancing, hygiene, and so on to keep people healthy and safe. And so far, that's been working. Now, there's still the question of, well, why is it important for us to keep operating? And I think that it's another important question. And the way I would describe it is that we recognize that there's a lot of people who depend on BHP. It's our shareholders, but it's not just our shareholders. It's the communities that we operate in. It's our employees who depend on BHP for employment. It's our business partners, and these are thousands of companies with many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees. And it's governments, both at the local, state, and federal levels, that depend on BHP for part of their revenues or income. And so we've felt a real accountability or responsibility to keep going as long as we can do so safely. I think we've demonstrated that we can do that, and through the way that 72,000 people have mobilized on this across BHP, I think we can be proud of the way that we've kept operations going and continue to be able to support all of those stakeholders that I spoke about.
Okay, Mike, well, let's stay with safety for a little bit. We've had another question here relating to technology and how that might help safety. The question is, will the pandemic cause you to speed up the deployment of autonomy and robots across your operations to keep your workforce safe?
So I'm glad that you were the person that asked that question, James, added that final bit on keeping people safe, because I think technology has helped to keep people safe through COVID-19. But as to the fundamental question about whether we will accelerate our efforts to deploy automation and robots as a result of the pandemic, no. The clear answer is no. Technology has been a very important priority within our strategy. And we've been deploying technology to improve productivity and to keep our people safe for some time now. If you look at our iron ore business in WA, at one of our mines, Jimbo Bar, we already have all of our trucks automated, autonomous haulage. We have automated drills across the business. We have automated ship loaders. And we've recently announced that we are moving to autonomous haulage at our Goonyella Riverside mine in Queensland, our Newman East mine in iron ore in WA. And we'll continue to consider whether it makes sense to deploy autonomous haulage at our Daunia mine in Queensland. So we've got a track record of applying technology to keep people safe and to improve productivity, but we will only do so where the value case is there or where there's a strong safety case for it. All of our technology investments get run through our capital allocation framework, just like any other investment that BHP makes. Now, I mentioned that technology had helped us to stay safe through COVID-19. We've had a ton of ideas coming up from the front line, which we assess, we trial, and then we've deployed a number of these. But we've also used technology to allow us to move quite seamlessly to working remotely. And that can be people working from home in our offices through to some of our operational activities. So we already have integrated remote operating centers in Perth, in Brisbane, in Santiago. And these have allowed us to conduct our mine planning, coordination, and control activities off of site, which has helped to reduce the number of people on site, support social distancing, and reduce the pace of spread of COVID-19. So technology, strategically important to us. We have a track record in it. We're good at it. We'll pursue it where it makes sense to do so for value or for safety. And it's also helped us to manage the COVID-19 risk in the near term.
Well, Mike, you mentioned pre and post-COVID focus. So I've got a question here on climate change. And a shareholder asks, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted your efforts to reduce carbon emissions?
In short, it hasn't. We have decades behind us now of showing leadership in address or taking steps to mitigate the risk of climate change. We've recently spoken about the commitment that we have around further reductions in Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So those are our operational emissions within BHP. And also our commitment to work in a very constructive and tangible way with our customers and others in the supply chain to help reduce Scope 3 emissions or broader emissions. That commitment remains unabated. It was there pre the COVID-19 pandemic, and coming out of COVID-19, we will remain every bit as committed to ensuring that we play our very important role in addressing the risk of climate change.
Okay, look, we'll have time for one more question, Mike, and it's a question about what BHP is doing for the regional and Indigenous communities adjacent to our operating centres.
Great. I'm very happy to have that as a final question, James, because I think that this, or I hope that this is something that BHP shareholders take a bit of pride in. And that's the leadership that we've shown and the actions that we've taken in the face of this pandemic to support those around us. And you know, a few things I would point to would be that very early on, we came out with a commitment to reduce payment terms. So this is getting cash into the hands of our small, local, and Indigenous suppliers earlier. We've kind of gone from, in many instances, down from 30 days to 7 days. And this is because we recognize that they would be facing very challenging times, and we saw ourselves as having a role in supporting them through these tough circumstances. Shortly after that, we established a $50 million Vital Resources Fund here in Australia that's meant to support the communities within which we operate. We've done something similar since in Chile. Our petroleum business is supporting their local communities as well. And more recently, we've announced funding between BHP and the BHP Foundation has done something similar, but we have funding to support research into a vaccine for COVID-19, funding to support clinical trials for drug treatment of COVID-19, and so on. So there's a lot that we're doing. Finally, on our engagement with Indigenous communities and peoples. In Western Australia, for example, we have many Indigenous regional communities that are close to our operations. And so again, very early on in the crisis, we took the step of postponing face-to-face engagement because we wanted to minimize any risk of transmission of the virus into those communities. And since then, we've been working with those communities, with others in business, and with governments to ensure that they have proper health support and to ensure that there's appropriate distancing between people in those communities and the regional centers where the risk of transmission may be greater. So I really see this as an area where BHP's purpose and values have shone through. And I hope it's something that shareholders are not only supportive of, but they're proud of.
Great. Well, thanks, Mike. That's all the time we have in terms of questions. Thanks again to all those shareholders who did submit the questions. Any final comments from your side, Mike, before we close?
Look, James, the probably final comments would be that I know that this session is talking to our shareholders, and many of those shareholders have had a long-term commitment to BHP. That's a responsibility that we hold quite dearly, and I know that they want to have the confidence that this is a resilient company that's able to weather the current challenging times. And we have over 100 years of weathering quite challenging circumstances. This isn't the first tough set of circumstances that BHP has faced. And time and again, we've shown that we are a strong company. We've got the strength of the portfolio, the strength of our people, the strength of our values that allow us to see through these times in good shape. This time is no different. I think everybody can see that in our third quarter operational results. I hope that people take some confidence from the leadership that we're showing in industry and the way that we're supporting those around us. And again, we've got a great portfolio of assets. There's been a lot of work in recent years to ensure that we've got a strong balance sheet. So we are positioned very well for the current tough market circumstances that we're facing.
Great. Well, thanks, Mike. That's a good note to finish on. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.